Hello, my little rutabagas. Are you ready for the next story in My Naughty Little Sister, a Treasury Collection? I am. Let's begin. The Icy-Cold Tortoise, written by Dorothy Edwards, illustrated by Shirley Hughes. Long ago, when I was a little girl and had a little sister, we lived next door to a kind lady called Mrs. Jones. My sister used to call this lady Mrs. Coco sometimes. If my mother had to go out and couldn't take my little sister, this kind next-door lady used to mind her. My sister was always glad to be minded by dear Mrs. Jones, and Mrs. Coco Jones was always glad to mind my little sister. They enjoyed minding days very much. Well now, one cold blowy day, when the wind was pulling all the old leaves off the trees to make room for the new baby ones to grow, our mother asked Mrs. Coco Jones to mind my sister while she went shopping. Mrs. Coco and my sister had a lovely time. They swept up all the leaves from Mr. Jones's nice tidy paths and put them into a heap for him to burn. They went indoors and laid Mr. Jones's tea, and they were just going to sit down by the fire to have a rest when they heard Mr. Coco coming down the back path. Mr. Coco came down the path pushing his bicycle with one hand and holding a very strange-looking wooden box with holes in it in the other hand. When Mr. Jones saw my little sister peeping at him out of his kitchen window, he smiled and smiled. "Hello, Mrs. Pickle," he said. "What are you doing here, then?" "I'm being minded," said my little sister. Then, because she was an inquisitive child, she said, "What have you got in that box, Mr. Coco?" "Just wait a minute and I'll show you," Mr. Coco said, and he went off to put his bicycle in the shed. "I wonder what's in that box, Mrs. Coco," said my inquisitive little sister. "It's a very funny box. It's got holes in it." "Ah," said Mrs. Coco, "just you wait and see." When kind Mr. Coco came in and saw my impatient little sister, he was so good he didn't even stop to take off his coat. He opened the box at once, and he showed my sister an icy-cold tortoise lying fast asleep under a lot of hay. Have you ever seen a tortoise? My little sister hadn't. Tortoises are very strange animals. They have hard round shells and long crinkly necks and little beaky noses. They have tiny black eyes and 4 scratchy looking claws. But when they are asleep, you can't see their heads or their claws. They are tucked away under their shells. They just look like cold round stones. My little sister thought the tortoise was a stone at first. She touched it, and it was icy cold. "What is it?" she said. "What is this stone thing?" Mr. Coco picked the tortoise up and showed her where the little claws were tucked away, and the beaky little shut-eyed face under the shell. "It's a tortoise," Mr. Coco said. "He's having his winter sleep now," said Mrs. Coco. Mr. Jones told my sister that one of the men who worked with him had given him the tortoise because he was going away and wouldn't have anywhere to keep it in his new home. "I shall put him away in the cupboard under the stairs now," he said. "He will sleep there all winter and wake up again when the warm days come." Just as Mr. Coco said this, the tortoise opened its beady black eyes and looked at my sister. Then it closed them again and went to sleep. So Mr. Coco put it away in its box right at the back of the cupboard under the stairs. "That's a funny animal," my naughty little sister said. After that, she talked and talked about the tortoise. She kept saying, "When will it wake up? When will it wake up?" But it didn't, so she got tired of asking. By the time Christmas came, she had almost forgotten it, and when the snow fell, she quite forgot it. And when spring came and the birds began to sing again, and she went in one day to have her morning cocoa with her next-door friend, Mrs. Jones had forgotten it too. They were just drinking their cocoa, and Mrs. Jones was telling my naughty little sister about some of the things she had done when she was a little girl, when they heard thump, thump, bang, bang. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Coco, "there's someone at the front door." And she went to look, but there wasn't. Thump, thump. "It must be at the back door," said Mrs. Coco Jones, and she went to look, but it wasn't. Bang, bang. "What can it be?" asked Mrs. Jones. Now, my clever little sister had been listening hard. "It's in the under the stairs place, Mrs. Coco," she said. "Listen." Thump, thump, bang, bang. "Oh, goodness," said Mrs. Coco. But she was a brave lady. She opened the door of the cupboard and looked, and my little sister looked too. And Mrs. Coco stared, and my little sister stared. There was the tortoise's wooden box, shaking and bumping because the cross tortoise inside had woken up and was banging to be let out. "Goodness me," said Mrs. Coco, "that tortoise has woken up." "Goodness me," said my funny little sister, "that tortoise has woken up." And Mrs. Coco looked hard at my sister, and my sister looked hard at her. "I shall have to see to it," Mrs. Coco said, and she picked up the bumping box and carried it into her kitchen and put the box on the table. Then she lifted my sister up to the chair so she could watch. Mrs. Coco lifted the lid off the box, and there was that wide-awake tortoise. His head was waggling and his claws scratching to get out. "I used to have a tortoise when I was a girl," Mrs. Coco said, "so I know just what to do." And do you know what she did? She put some warm water into a bowl, and she put the tortoise in the warm water. Then she took it out and dried it very, very carefully on an old soft towel. Then Mrs. Coco put the clean, fresh tortoise on the table and said, "Just mind it while I go and get it something to eat. There's a good child. Just put your hand gently on his back and he will stay quite still." My little sister did keep her hand on the tortoise's back, and he was quite still until Mrs. Coco came back with a cabbage leaf. "Look," my naughty little sister said. "Look at his waggly head, Mrs. Jones." And she put her face right down so she could see his little black eyes. "Hello, Mr. Tortoise," she said. And the tortoise made a funny noise at her. It said, "Hiss, hiss." My poor sister was surprised. She didn't like that noise very much. But Mrs. Coco said the tortoise had only said hiss, hiss because it was hungry and not because it was cross. Mrs. Coco said tortoises are nice, friendly things so long as you let them go their own way. And because my sister had minded the tortoise for her, she let her give him the cabbage leaf. At first he only looked at it and pushed it about with his beaky head, but at last he bit a big piece out of it. "There," Mrs. Jones said, "that's the first thing he's tasted since last summer." Just fancy that! Mr. Coco made the tortoise a little home in his rockery where it could sleep, and it could walk around among the stones or hide among the rockery flowers if it wanted to. Sometimes it used to eat the flowers and make Mr. Coco cross. That tortoise lived with the Coco Joneses for many, many years. It slept under the stairs in the winter and walked about the rockery in summer. It was still there when my sister was a grown-up lady. Mr. and Mrs. Coco called it Henry. But of course, when my sister was little, she always called it Henry Coco Jones. I liked that story about the tortoise. One time when I was walking, my dog started sniffing and digging in the leaves, and it was autumn, same as when Mr. Coco Jones got his tortoise. Of course, he got it from another person who was keeping it as a pet, but I found a tortoise. Well, my dog really found the tortoise, but I took it home and I begged to keep it, and I kept it for about 3 days, and then my family convinced me that the tortoise really loved its life free and wild, so I brought it back to the woods and let it go. But it was still really fun looking at that tortoise, and I think I even did a little drawing of it. I hope you guys go exploring outside and see what different things you can find. Maybe you'll see a tortoise. Who knows?